In this video, we're going to start designing a screen to help us manage our vehicle listing. So let us just start our application and refresh ourselves with what we've done so far. And we have a menu listing here that allows us to add, remove, edit, and view listings. So I'm actually just going to do all of that from, well, one window, and, case by case, we'll probably design something else. So I'm going to modify this entire listing or this entire menu strip and just have manage vehicle listing. So I'm going to remove all of the child options of that menu, and I can just click and delete. So when I click that one and it's selected, I can just press delete and it will actually just remove that menu item. So that's how you can go about removing them, right? So I want one that says manage vehicle listing. And when I click it, I'm going to launch a new form that allows me to see all the vehicles in the database and then perform the CRUD activities from there. So I'm going to do everything from one window. So firstly, I'm going to double click and do the click event on that button. So there are a number of activities that need to be done, and to a great extent, they don't need to be done in any particular order. So I'm creating the click event, but I'm not going to put anything in the click event because, well, the ultimate reason for the click event would be to launch the window, and I haven't yet created that form, right? So yes, I have the click event, but I need to create the form. So in no particular order, I have stuff to do. I'm just saying that to say that, don't think that you have a strict order of or a series of activities that have to be performed in a particular order, right? So I have the click event already. We can come back to that, but I'm going to right click my project, go to add, say new item. And once again, I'm creating a blank form. And then this time I'm going to call it manage vehicle listing. All right. So my form is manage vehicle listing. I can spend some time doing some cosmetic changes where I'm going to make the text in the title bar not look so, programming look like. All right, so manage vehicle listing. And then I'm going to start looking at some new controls. And the first new control would be the grid view control. So in my toolbox, I'm going to go into the subcategory data. And then I'm going to see one that says DataGridView. So DataGridView displays rows and columns of data in a grid that you can customize. All right, so that is what we're going to drag over. So I drag over that data grid view, and you notice that it's just this big gray box. So I'm just going to expand this gray box to a certain extent. If I use that caret, I get back that menu, and I can edit columns, add columns, enable edit, delete, and add addition functions to the grid. If I want, I can also dock in the container. So if I dock in the container, it fills the entire container, right? That's not necessarily what I want, because I'm going to put in a label at the top to say manage vehicle listing. And I'm also going to put in some other things in here. So, maybe you start off with one idea of what you want to do, and then you realize that, oh, but you don't have to do it that way. You could do it another way. Sometimes that happens. So let's start off by not having it docked. And I'm going to bring over a label. So I have a label in add rental record already. So instead of going and trying to design a brand new label, I'm just going to copy this, come back over to my new form, paste it, make sure I position it, and I'm going to change the text. I go to properties, change the text, and this one is manage vehicle listing. All right. So I just reposition it accordingly. All right, so our new window for managing the vehicle listing. Now, the most important part of this is our grid view. So our grid view will give us like a tabular representation of whatever data we tell it that we want to see, right? So you can think of Excel, or even in the database when we did a select star from a table and we noticed that we get that tabular representation. That's exactly what that data grid view allows us to do. So the first thing that we do with these, well, I call them more essential controls, because a label is essential, but not that much. But I want to know the name of my grid view, right? So I go to properties after clicking grid view, and you can take some time and look at the properties, and you realize that these properties, with every control, there are different properties. And of course, each control is unique in its own right. But the one common property is going to be name. And I don't want my data grid view to be called data grid view. So I'm going to call this DV, or GV grid view, right? And this is car list or vehicle list, whichever one. So remember my prefix and then the name of whatever it is that this control is for. So grid view for vehicle list. Then I'm going to set up this form that when it loads, I run a query for the vehicles and I put that data or the data that's coming back from that query inside of this grid view, right? So remember we did something similar to that when we were looking at launching our car, where was it? Or add rental record form when we wanted to make sure that our combo box had all the data it needed from the listing of cars, right? So in this case, we want the grid view to have that same data when the form loads. So since I want it to happen when the form loads, the when this happens, that is the event that I want. So I'm going to click on the form, go over to properties, the lightning bolt, and I'm saying that when the form loads, I want this particular thing to happen. So I'm just going to double click inside the load section and now it's saying, okay, this is the form name underscore load. So when the form loads, what do I want to happen? So the next thing I want to do, of course, is establish the database connection and then I can start running my queries. So if you forgot how that works, you can go back to the add rental record code file where what we did was declare an object that represented our connection to the database. We initialize it inside of our constructor, and then wherever we needed to access the database, we simply called on that object, right? So we're going to follow that same pattern. So in our new form, the first thing I want to do is in the class, I'm defining a private and I'm making it read only. That's muscle memory because in .NET that always happens. It's no, you can do it without the read only. That's fine. But I want it to be of type car rental entities. Now, if you forgot where this name came from, then in the EDMX file that you would have created for this project, that's a car rental db.edmx in my case. But if you have a different name, it must be .edmx. You can double click that. You'll see your data model. But when you go to properties, you will see entity container name, and that is the class type that represents the connection to your database. All right, so if you ever forget the name or you are doing one from scratch, you just look in entity container name, and whatever name is there, that is your data type. All right, so back in our new code file for our new form, we say private read only car rental entities, which is our entity container name, and then I'm going to give it the object name. So Visual Studio is always making suggestions, and that's really cool. I took one of the suggestions in the previous form where I said add car rental. Let me find that code file quickly. So in the previous one where I accessed the database, I used Visual Studio's suggestion, and that's fine. But a lot of the times on the internet, you probably see something like context being used or underscore DB. The fact is the name of the object is it's inconsequential to the functionality. All right. So I can name my object anything. So in this situation, I'm going to name it underscore DB. That being said, however, I do promote consistency. So if you started on one path, continue down that path. If you want to change the path right throughout your code. So don't have underscore DB in this form and then car rental record rental entities in another form, and then another form you feel another way and you call it context or CTX. Don't do that, right? Have one consistent naming convention. I'm doing it this way just to show you that whatever you call the object is inconsequential. All right. So I'm going to use DB in this situation. However, later on, I will go through and normalize everything to underscore DB. All right. So private read only car rental entities DB. And then inside of my constructor, underneath initialize component, I'm going to say underscore DB is equal to a new instance of car rental entity. So that's the initialization, right? So when our program runs or when this form is launched, it knows about the DB, then it initializes its components and the DB, and then throughout the rest of the form, anytime we need to talk to our database, we have our underscore DB object. So the first thing I want to do is run that query to get the car. So I'm going to say var cars, and I use cars and vehicles interchangeably. So whichever one you want to use, that's fine. But var cars is equal to database connection dot, and I don't want the car rental record, so I can just scroll until I see the table that looks like what I want, which is types of cars, and then I can say dot to list. So I want the list or a list of the types of cars in my database, and then I'm storing all of those inside of a variable called cars. All right, and then the next step would be to let the data grid know that it should be displaying whatever is coming back inside of the list of cars. So I can say GV, right? So because I renamed it, I know it's a grid view, so I call it GV vehicle list dot data source is equal to cars, right? So the list of cars coming back from the database will serve as the data source for my data grid. So let us see how that looks. So I click start, and then when the window comes up, I'm clicking and nothing is happening. And why is nothing happening? And we see that we still have a stray menu item, but nothing is happening. And that's because I did not finish up my click event. So I finished wiring up the form, or at least for now, I've wired up the form. So I'm going to go back over to my main window design, or to the code file rather. And then here is that click event. So I have to go to design because I missed a menu item. So I need to delete this one. All right, good. All right, so now that we've cleaned up the interface back in our code file, what we need to do is let the button launch the new form. So I'm just going to say var, and this one is going to be vehicle listing is equal to new, and I call it vehicle manage vehicle listing. All right, and then I have to say that its MDI parent is this. So vehicle listing dot MDI parent is equal to this, which is main window. And then finally, after we've gotten all of that out of the way, I want to show. All right, so let's try that again. So I'm going to launch our application. And then when I click manage vehicle listing, now we're seeing our listing. And look at this now. So we're seeing the grid view, and I mean, it looks somewhat anemical. We see the big gray box, and we see the grid filling out as much of the box as possible. We see that we're getting back the ID and the name and this seemingly random column from the database called car rental records. But the fact is that we are seeing the car rental records in that grid view. So now we can go back to this window and maybe clean it up a bit. So I'm going to get out of this. So I'm going to modify the width of this grid view because I really don't need it to fill, that much space for two columns. So I'm seeing ID, name, and well, car rental records. And I'll explain what that seemingly random column is, but I want to add the button. So I did take out the ability to edit, add, and remove the cars from the menu listing in the main window. So what I'm going to do is put buttons inside of this window that will be responsible for helping us do those actions, right? So I'm going to have 4 buttons or 3 buttons. So I made one button and I'm just copying it and pasting, and I have a spare one. All right. And then for my buttons, for the properties, one, I want the text to say what I want it to do. So button 1, let's say we want to make this the add new car, right? The button 3, I want this, and I'll just pin properties so that I don't have to keep on going in and going out. So button 3, I want this one to be edit car, and then this one would be delete car. All right. And then another important step to having my buttons is that I don't want them to be BTN button 1, button 2, button 3. I want them to have sensible names that I can reference them in the code behind, right? So button 1, I'm going to rename to BTN. That's my prefix for button. Add car, right? Edit car is going to be BTN edit car, all right? And then the final one would be BTN delete car. All right. So then I can go ahead and create click events for them from now if I want. So I'm going to double click the add car, and notice because I gave it a sensible name, the click event is very clear. BTN add car underscore click, right? So I can just go ahead and create all those click events accordingly. So I just go back and double click each until I have those click events. And then this is why I don't like pinning properties, because when writing code, it's not useful, right? So then I have 3 button click events for 3 buttons on my form. So that's just some cosmetic stuff. Let's just start again and see what that looks like. All right, so now we see that the grid is a bit smaller and we have the data being displayed, sure. But then to the right, we see our buttons. And well, they're all dead buttons because they have click events, but the click events aren't doing anything just yet. So now I want to clean up the grid a bit. I don't want the ID and name columns to be displaying in common letters like that. So what I'm going to do is inside of my form load function, when I set the data source, so notice that the data grid is generating the columns relative to the data it is being fed. So I'm feeding it the list of cars, and the list of cars, each object has ID, it has name, and some list of car rental records, right? Which I'll soon explain exactly what that is. Well, at least later on, we'll see exactly what that is. So what I'm going to do for my data grid is I'm going to say GV vehicle list dot, and then I want to specify that I want the first column, which I know is going to be ID. So I can say columns. And if you have ever worked with arrays or collections, so we are working with a list, and that's a collection type. If you ever work with an array, you know that the square brackets represent, you can specify exactly which subscript of the array you want, right? So if you haven't, that's fine. So let me explain. So the columns here, this is the grid view control. And then I'm saying I want the columns. And if it's columns, that means it's a collection. There's more than one columns. I want the first column, which I know as a programmer is going to be ID anyway. So I can say square bracket 0, because in computers, you start counting from 0 and not 1, right? So the first subscript of an array is 0. So the first subscript is 0. And then I want the property of this, which is the header text, to be equal to the text ID in all caps, right? So I'm saying that after I get the list of cars and then I set the data source, at this point, all of the columns would have been generated. I'm saying that the first column that was generated, I want the header text to be ID. And then I want the second column. So I'm just going to duplicate that line and change the subscript from 0 to 1. And I want this one to be name in all caps. All right, so let's see how that looks. So if I click start, then I'm going to see that I'm getting ID, name, and I'm still seeing car rental records, but at least the column headers are changing accordingly. So that's encouraging at least. All right, so the next thing I want to do is to eliminate the fact that I'm getting back that seemingly random car rental records column. But before I do that, let me just explain a bit what that represents. So I opened up my data model, which is the EDMX file, and I'm seeing this ERD. If we look in the table types of car or types of cars, we will see that we have the ID, we have the name, and then below we have this navigation property called car rental records, right? So just humor me for a bit and let me take you down this journey. If you have a rental system and then you have a car that is rented multiple times, then that means that this car is associated with multiple records, right? So if I wanted to know how many times my I believe I have a car called Lada or Honda, how many times my Honda was rented, then I would have literally a list of the times this car was rented, right? So that is exactly what this navigation property represents. It says that for any car that you're going to look at, I can show you the list of rental records that it is associated with because they are related. All right. And then in the same way, the car rental record knows the exact type of car that was rented in this record. So this is how LINQ and Entity Framework actually go about helping you to form good relationships between your tables and actually query data across multiple tables with much ease. But without getting too much into, complicating exactly how they're used right now, I don't need the reference to the car rental records just yet. So back in my code file, I'm going to tweak this query a bit to select exactly what I want. So this is doing a select star, and we did a select star in our add rental record once again for our combo box, where I said that doing it this way is just like saying select star. In this case, we don't want star. We literally just want ID and name, because when we're doing it this way, we're getting back the seemingly random column of car rental records, right? So I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you how we can tweak this. So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to say that this is the way you do select star from types of cars, right? Just so we're clear. But then I'm going to rewrite this query and I'm going to walk you through exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to say var cars once again is equal to the connection to the database dot the table that I want, but then I'm not going to say dot to list this time. I'm going to say dot select. All right. And then when I do that, I'm going to have to work a bit of, I'm going to call it magic. But as I said, I'm here to guide you through. So I want to select just the two columns that I want. I'm sure if you do, if you're used to SQL, then you would think that you just say, oh, ID, comma, name. Well, it's unfortunately not that simple in C#. We're going to have to do what we call a lambda expression, where we create an object, right? So this is lambda. So that's just it, right? There's nothing more to explain. The only thing I can explain here is that this doesn't have to be a Q. This could be a W. This could be a word. I mean, you can use any expression you want, but the Q or whatever expression you use here is going to represent every object that is inside of the collection, right? So this is just how you start a lambda expression. You have an expression, whether you want to use a letter or a word or whatever, and then you have equal and then the greater than sign, or I just call it the arrow, right? So you have the expression, then the arrow, and then this allows you to say what columns you want from the table. So I'm saying select, then I initialize a lambda expression, and then using the lambda expression, I can say q dot ID, right? But then I don't want just ID, I want a new object. So what I'm going to say is new, and then I open up my curly braces, and then inside of this, I'm going to specify that I want an ID being equal to q dot ID. Then I can use my comma and say I want a new property called name, and it should have the value q dot name. All right. So if you're used to SQL and aliasing, right, where in SQL you would have said something like select this and you give it an alias. So you'd have selected the column and you would say select ID as another name and select name as something else or whatever. This is how you go about doing aliasing inside of LINQ, right? So once again, let me just walk you through what we're doing. We're saying I want to connect to the database, give me the table, and then I want to select, and then we do a lambda expression. And then after the lambda expression, we're selecting a new object. So we're literally just building an object on the fly. This is just a new object that we're creating for our own purpose. And what I want in my object is a property called ID, which is going to get the value that's coming from the database with an ID, comma, another property called name, and it is going to get the value coming from the database with the word name. And once again, these are aliases, right? So I could have used anything here. I didn't have to use ID and name again. I could have used car ID, right? And I could have used car name. It doesn't really matter. So it's up to me to know what I am naming these. Once again, these are aliases if you are used to SQL. And then for as many properties as they're coming back and I want to create an alias, I could just say comma and do the same alias equals lambda expression dot whichever column I want. All right. Or lambda variable rather. And then after doing all of that, I notice all of that happened inside of the curly braces. Then I would end with a semicolon. But then I would probably want to do a to list also. So I like lists. So, and trust me, it makes it much easier to just, when you do a LINQ query, just make everything a list afterwards if you're selecting, expecting a collection of results, right? And then some people would actually break this into multiple lines. So they would actually do something like the query here, and then they say dot select in another line. And then sometimes they would even break that out a bit more. But I won't do that one though. So that is how you would go about building up an aliasing system. So this situation will be more like select. And then I would say something like ID as car ID, comma, name as car name from types of cars. Right? So I'm just showing you that LINQ is very powerful and it does create some wonderful abstraction from the typical SQL while maintaining C# code. It does take practice. It does take getting used to. So if you have to kind of do it to be able to reap the benefits of what it allows you to do, right? So if I do start again, and then we look at our grid, we see that we're getting back ID, we're getting back name, and we're only getting back those two. We're not getting back that third column again. And that's once again because I specified what I wanted to select. And even though I changed the names, I still told the grid view that the ID should be the column name for the first one and name the column name for the second one. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint at the point where we're setting the data source, and I'm going to close the window and I'm going to load it again. And then I'm going to look inside of my cars variable where you see it's coming back with 5. And if you look at the object listing, you're seeing car ID and car name. So we created custom objects that we wanted to create a list, and then that list of custom objects is being used as a data source for our grid. And then we set the column names, and then our grid is displayed. So I'm removing the breakpoint, clicking continue, and that is the outcome. So in the next video, we'll start looking at how we wire up these buttons for adding to the database, editing car record, and removing a car record.